All right, buckle up because we're about to dive headfirst into the bizarre and hilarious saga of Albert Einstein's brain. A story that's part scientific intrigue, part soap opera, and 100% bonkers. Forget what you think you know because we're about to rewrite some history, sprinkle in some humor, and uncover the real juicy details behind one of the strangest heists of all time. So let's start with the day Einstein decided to check out of this cosmic hotel. It was April 17th, 1955. Albert, bless his genius heart, was feeling a bit chesty. Turns out his aorta, the main superhighway of blood in your body, was having a major meltdown. Specifically, an abdominal aortic aneurysm decided to party a little too hard and was about to burst. Picture it like a water balloon about to go kaboom. Now, Einstein, in true Einstein fashion, wasn't exactly focusing on this life or death situation. He was busy crafting a speech for Israel's 7th anniversary. Priorities, right? The doctors, probably sweating bullets, wanted to wheel him straight to surgery, but good old Albert, having had the same issue addressed 8 years prior, was like, "Nah, fam, I've had my run. I'll die when I want." He famously uttered, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go, and I will do it elegantly." And elegant he did, passing away in the early hours of the next day at Princeton Hospital, a hospital whose name might ring a bell for fans of House. Though let's be clear, that was just a TV show, folks. Real life rarely has that much drama. Now, this is where our story takes a sharp turn into the utterly bizarre. The autopsy was performed by one Thomas Harvey, a pathologist whose ambitions were, shall we say, slightly misplaced. 7 hours after Einstein's departure, and without the permission of the family, Harvey decided that Einstein's brain was too precious to be left in a corpse and decided to perform some extracurricular surgery. He sliced it out of Einstein's head and gave it a nice bath in a 10% formalin solution. Yes, that's right, he essentially pickled the greatest brain of the 20th century without asking. His justification? He had to, study it, figure out what made it so special. Let's pause here for a second. Einstein, a man who loathed idolization, had explicitly stated that he wanted to be cremated and have his ashes scattered secretly. Harvey, on the other hand, clearly missed that memo, deciding that his scientific curiosity trumped Einstein's last wishes. To add insult to injury, he didn't just take the brain, he also plucked out the eyeballs and gave them to Einstein's eye doctor, Henry Abrams, like some sort of morbid souvenir. Harvey, realizing he'd just committed a scientific and ethical blunder of epic proportions, went into damage control mode. He somehow managed to convince Einstein's son, Hans Albert, that what he had done was for the greater good, the pinnacle of scientific endeavor. He got retroactive permission under the condition that the brain would only be used for research and that the findings would be published in peer-reviewed journals. He even promised Hans that he'd publish his findings within a year. Spoiler alert, that was a promise Harvey was never gonna keep. And this is where things get even more comical. Because what did Harvey do with the brain he so desperately wanted to study? Well, he didn't exactly rush into groundbreaking research. Instead, he chopped it into 240 pieces, each about the size of a sugar cube. Yum. Made microscopic slides of the samples, and then pretty much nothing. He lacked the knowledge, expertise, and funding to actually do anything. He did take some pretty cool pictures and recorded the positions of each sample, but it sat in his basement. This scientific treasure was gathering dust in his basement, like an old baseball card you forgot you had. Harvey's scientific endeavor was more of a scientific hoarding. He got fired a few days later from Princeton Hospital for obvious ethical breaches and was forced to move to the Midwest with his prized possession. He spent the next 30 years trying to convince other scientists of the significance of his brain heist. He even tried to return it to Einstein's grandson, who was not amused to be handed a bunch of pickled brain bits. Harvey, a man whose life revolved around Einstein's brain, was seen as a crank, a charlatan, and he became the butt of jokes among his colleagues. It wasn't until Harvey found his way back to Princeton and the original hospital that he worked for that things started to get back on track. It was this point that Harvey handed the brain pieces over to a pathologist. This marked the end of a 40-year-long journey for both Harvey and the brain, and researchers were then able to begin a journey of their own. Now, let's debunk some of the Einstein myths that often circulate, because it seems that people love to get some juicy stories mixed up with the truth, because who doesn't love a good underdog story? Firstly, the myth of Einstein being a terrible student. People often love to tell themselves, see, even Einstein failed, so I can still be a genius. While that is a nice sentiment, it just isn't true. This idea is more of a soothing balm to our own insecurities rather than actual history. In reality, Einstein's grades were pretty stellar. His grades in secondary school were high. He excelled in math, physics, and history. He wasn't a slacker in the back row getting detention. He was a good student. His mom once wrote a letter to her sister saying, "Albert got his report card yesterday. He was again the first in his class. His report is brilliant." The reason people think Einstein was a terrible student is due to a couple of things. One is that his schooling in Switzerland used a different grading system than his previous school in Germany, where the highest grade was a 1 and the lowest was a 6. In Switzerland, the highest grade was a 6 and the lowest was a 1. Secondly, he had his disagreements with his teachers, not due to his ability, but due to his dislike for the strict militaristic tone of the education system. He expressed this on many occasions through letters, but this was not due to his ability to learn. And if it were any consolation to those of you who are a bit more slow at learning languages, his worst grade was in French. So, with that myth thoroughly smashed, let's ask, what actually made Einstein so special? Was it the brain? Well, let's delve into what researchers found. First off, contrary to what some might think, Einstein's brain wasn't some giant bulging mass. In fact, it was smaller than average, weighing in at about 1,230 grams, while the average for a man of his age and size would be closer to 1,400 grams. So much for bigger is better when it comes to brains, right? Turns out, it's not about size, but about what you do with it. Kind of like that tiny yet super powerful USB drive you carry around. However, his brain had some unique anatomical quirks. For starters, the frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex thought, had an extra gyrus, a ridge on the brain's surface, on his right side, not the left side, which you might expect given he was a mathematician, but the right side. This is thought to relate to his non-verbal and mathematical aptitude, which is also quite interesting as some of his peers reported that his mathematical style was different from most. They reported that he did not see the mathematical equations and figures as symbols on a page, but as pictures in his mind. Then there's the hand motor knob, or omega sign, an unusual formation that related to the dexterity of hands and fingers. This was far more prominent in his brain and suggests he began playing the violin before the age of 14, which he did. He began the violin at the age of 6 and played it throughout his life. So this brain was apparently a bit of a musical genius too. And that's not all, folks. He had an abnormal amount of nerves in the brain that related to language, which might explain why he was unable to talk coherently until he was 6. He also had difficulties expressing his thoughts through writing and remembering vocabulary. He could not speak, read, or write very well into adulthood, and his peers all reported that he was slow at doing all of these things. It is thought that Einstein might have been mildly dyslexic, and this could explain the differences in the structures in the language centers of the brain. However, the areas of the brain related to math, physics, and symbolic reasoning, specifically the left inferior parietal lobe, were larger than average by around 15%. There is also evidence to suggest that his hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with memory, and the neocortex, associated with higher cognitive function, were larger too. Finally, the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres of the brain, was thicker than normal. This suggests that Einstein's brain was capable of working in a coordinated way between the two hemispheres, and potentially explains why it is thought his brain worked like a supercomputer. Now, the million-dollar question: were these brain differences genetic, or did they develop as a result of his intense focus on physics and mathematics? Well, here's where things get a little murky, because brains aren't like static sculptures. Brains are more like hot plastic. They can change and mold themselves based on our experience. This is called neuroplasticity. When you start learning something new, your brain forms new connections and strengthens existing ones. For example, when a child begins to learn math or physics, the brain creates the neural connections to do this. And these changes can happen throughout our lives. But the thing about all of this is that these changes happen on a microscopic scale, and it would be a leap to say that these microscopic differences are the reason for anatomical changes on the scale of a brain gyrus or the structure of different brain regions. A child's brain is 90% the size of an adult's by age 6, so the major structural differences have been formed by that age. And Einstein wasn't exactly pondering the mysteries of the cosmos at age 6. However, we know that a child's brain is influenced both by its genetics and by the environment in which the child grows. So it's likely a bit of both, and it was a mix of nature and nurture that helped Einstein to become Einstein. But one thing that we can say is that the variations in Einstein's brain were in areas associated with movement and senses, which would fit his description of how he thought. Einstein himself admitted that he thought in images and colors rather than words. Einstein's way of seeing the universe was also unusual. He didn't take his lead from mathematics or experiments, but instead from aesthetics. He would ask himself, if I were God, would I make the universe like this? And if it didn't look right to him, he would rethink his position. This aesthetic perspective helped him develop his theory of relativity, which stated that space and time were both part of the same fabric. But the same aesthetic bias that helped him also blocked him for 2 years while trying to create the general theory of relativity. He was holding on to his aesthetic and mathematical perspective, and once he finally dropped it and let the math lead, he was able to form his general theory of relativity. It is also important to point out that he relied on the classical physics that his theory was to replace, and he never accepted the ideas and principles of quantum physics, which ultimately led him to make a lot of errors in his later life. So, was Einstein born a genius? Well, maybe partially. Did his experiences and persistence play a role? Absolutely. Einstein wasn't just a genius sitting in a corner waiting for inspiration. He was an incredibly hardworking man who never stopped pushing his own boundaries, both in his work and outside of his work. For example, when he got stumped by a problem, he would go and play his violin. He knew that if he did that, the ideas would come to him. He was also incredibly stubborn, and if he had an idea that he believed was correct, he wouldn't stop working on it until he either solved it or found that he was wrong. And this is the real moral of the story, folks. Genius is not just a product of your genes or brain structure. It's a result of all kinds of things, including persistence, curiosity, stubbornness, and sometimes a bit of a peculiar outlook on life. Even if your school grades didn't look like Einstein's, you too can have new ideas and perspectives if you allow yourself to question, to probe, to never be satisfied with what you know, and to never give up. And now, back to that stolen brain. What about Thomas Harvey, the man at the center of this whole bizarre saga? In 2007, Harvey passed away, but his legacy remains. His actions, though ethically questionable, have contributed to some pretty interesting science. Harvey is quoted as saying he had no regrets over what he did. He saw it as his scientific duty and never felt that he did anything wrong. And this, in a nutshell, is the truly strange and hilarious story of Albert Einstein's brain. It's a reminder that science is as much a human story as it is a search for the truth. It is a story of curiosity, ambition, and oftentimes ridiculous choices. So next time you're struggling with a problem, remember Einstein and his brain. Maybe what you need isn't a brain transplant, but a little bit of curiosity and a lot more perseverance. Maybe a violin would help. So now that I've laid that all out for you, here's a summary of all the information in this video and the real reasons why Harvey stole the brain. Firstly, Harvey wasn't some kind of mad genius or evil scientist. He was simply a pathologist who lacked the skills to study the brain of one of the greatest thinkers of all time. Harvey knew he was in the presence of something special, and in his mind, he had a duty to preserve and study it to the best of his abilities, even though his abilities were a little lacking. He was overwhelmed by the magnitude of his task and didn't have the resources to perform any real science. All his efforts were more akin to a boy who finds a rare dinosaur bone and takes it home. He was unable to do anything with it except look at it, show it off, and try to make people believe it was important. Secondly, all of his actions and decisions were not thought out and lacked any kind of planning, making his actions more akin to a kind of chaotic comedy routine than science. It was like a kid who has been given something special and immediately decides to take it apart so that they can see how it works, but then quickly loses interest when they realize they don't know how to put it back together. Thirdly, he was overly optimistic about his own scientific abilities and had no idea about the difficulties of studying a brain. He truly believed that he could find a tangible difference between Einstein's brain and the average person's brain. This, combined with the fact he had no knowledge of neuroscience, was a recipe for disaster. He had no way of finding or interpreting any scientific results. Fourthly, the theft was due to an impulsive decision and was not part of any planned procedure or study. He acted without first asking for permission from the family and had no idea about the legal ramifications of his actions. He was in too much of a hurry to be responsible or ethical. Fifthly, his actions were partly due to the general lack of understanding of the complexities of the brain at the time. The brain was still a big mystery, and people truly believed that you could gain special knowledge from studying specific brains. It would not be inaccurate to say that there was a general sense of myth and legend around the brains of particularly brilliant people, and the story of Harvey is an example of how that might go wrong. Sixthly, even though he was able to get retrospective consent from Einstein's son, he was never able to convince the scientific community of the importance of what he had done. His peers all saw him as a fraud and a joke. It wasn't until much later that his actions were legitimized, and scientists could look at the brain samples and photographs that he had recorded. It's almost like he was waiting for the world to catch up to him and his ideas. So there you have it, the bizarre tale of Einstein's stolen brain. A story that's not just about science, but about the human condition, ego, ambition, and the occasional epic blunder. And above all, a tale that proves that the pursuit of knowledge can be both fascinating and completely bonkers. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll go play the violin.